You can tell when somebody comes in here and they haven't been to a video store in a decade. Their eyes light up. We want to welcome that.
They discover that this is a place that contains a broad representation of many kinds of world cinema.
We have movies that are out of print, movies that are hard to find,
The rare,
and something that you've never seen before.
we like to find the diamonds in the rough.
Just like a group of friends hanging out, talking movies, having a good time. They're here at Videodrome.
When you talk about Cary Grant, you're really talking about a multitude of different people. You're talking about young Archie Leach.
Whenever you think you've got the Morning Post licked, it's time for you to get out of town.
Whistling in the dark. Well, that isn't gonna help you this time. You're through.
Listen, the last man who said that to me was Archie Leach just a week before he cut his throat.
That's so.
Young Archie Leach, he leaves home, age 14. He goes and he joins a traveling vaudeville troupe. And he learns a lot of skills that will serve him throughout his career. Pantomime and acrobatics, and really kind of cultivates a skill for getting a rise out of an audience without saying a word.
But I think later in his career, you think of something like Bringing Up Baby, where his face is so rubbery and expressive, and he also does the whole Marx Brothers slapstick falling down pratfall thing. And I think he later on figured out how to nuance that. How to make that kind of early, overstated gesture, overstated actions work for him. And maybe it's because it was that sort of contrast with the debonair and cool Cary Grant when he would slip into that mania.
Right, or a synthesis of the two.
Yeah.
This sort of like sophisticated, somebody you trust, and therefore that's why it's so entertaining to see him be so silly.
Now be big. Be brave. You will, Bianca? Fine. Can I use your phone?
But that's why I think he's so beloved, because in an almost intimate way, he let us see the silly person. So many Hollywood stars never, ever express that kind of loopiness. He was close to embarrassing himself in certain moments in Bringing Up Baby when he's wearing the woman's, flouncy robe and, jumping in the air and being a madman. There's always the potential for coming off badly, but he made it work. He made it engaging and fun and always tapped into that kind of boyish quality.
And I feel like he was successful at that because he completely committed to it.
Yeah.
And he wasn't sort of winking at the camera like, look, I'm a really handsome, full-grown man and not
That's
like a
true.
stocky character actor.
Thinking matches?
Oh, yes.
Blue ought to go with blue, huh?
Better be coming.
It's for a friend of mine. He's waiting downstairs.
Oh, I see.
What's the matter with you?
He was also good at working different kinds of sort of comic strains. Like, he was very influenced by the Marx Brothers, but he was also influenced by Charlie Chaplin. So I think you see that Chaplin-esque sensibility in a film like North by Northwest, where he's doing that shaving scene. He's kind of disguising himself from the bad guys with a layer of shaving cream, and he starts slowly shaving it away with Eva Marie Saint's tiny, tiny little razor, and then he finally shaves down to a little mustache. I love that he could do that kind of really gentle, slow build comedy, but also full throttle crazy with no winking.
How do you do, Judge?
Oh, this isn't a pump handle.
He's sharp. Hey, you remind me of a man.
What man?
The man with the power.
What power?
The power of hoodoo.
Hoodoo?
You do.
Do what?
Remind me of a man.
Remind you? Oh.
Speaking of like slow build, creating the on-screen persona that we know as Cary Grant was a decades-long process. That went through a bunch of different evolutions, and he worked with a bunch of leading directors at the time that added little bits and pieces and got different performances out of him that together, by the end of his career formed the Cary Grant.
I think you're right. I think he was a sponge and an iconically self-made American. He took bits and pieces from all sorts of different people, from Noel Coward to Douglas Fairbanks Sr. And, he was said to be perpetually tan because he saw Douglas Fairbanks Sr. when he was crossing the Atlantic for the first time. He met him and just admired his healthiness, his healthy visage, and so made that part of his identity.
Now, you're all under arrest.
A whole bunch of you. And you too, and you know why. Her Majesty's very touchy about having her subject strangled. All right, I can't waste any more time. Come on, wrap up all your gear. You're coming with me. Hurry up about it.
He worked with Howard Hawks. He worked with George Cukor. He worked with
Leo McCary.
Joseph von Sternberg gave him his strong side part.
Right.
He was the one who came
right.
up with that
Exactly.
hairstyle.
Yeah.
And now we can't think of his hair any other way.
Right.
Except when he goes crazy and haywire and then he gets that little forelock dangling and then you know he's really on the crazy train.
Get out of there. Do you want to be poisoned? Do you want to be murdered? Do you want to be killed? Do you?
The fact that he was so independent in an era of complete studio control over actors' trajectories, he only signed one contract with the studio. And once he got out of that, he was free to choose his collaborators and his directors and his co-stars to a latitude that a lot of stars were not able to afford. And I think right.
Yeah.
And I think that did wonders for him self-consciously creating the persona that we know as Cary Grant.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting how he had his own one-person star system of developing himself more and more, but like you said, it's almost completely unique that he was never under contract. So watching these movies, it's important to keep in mind that while he may not have written the roles or always done them because he loved it, you know, or he thought it really hit, he chose all of those roles and probably rejected many that he thought wouldn't help improve his persona.
What are his chances if you don't operate?
He hasn't a prayer. You'll die.
Okay, then we operate.
Hitchcock talked about how there was something sinister to the Cary Grant character, and he really brought it out, especially in a film like Suspicion, where you have this suffocating charm that is gaslighting his poor wife.
You sold the chairs to gamble all your money on a horse.
Well, not exactly. I owed the bookies some money. It's an ancient story, but you know how bookies are.
What did I tell you?
You see, I got the £200 to pay them off. But then along came this hot tip and... Oh, darling, come on, give us a smile.
Come on, old girl. I know. You tickle her chin, I'll make faces.
Think that'll work?
Come on, son. Come on, dear.
I loved watching that film again. It felt so contemporary and true crime in some senses because, you know, he's like the ultimate conniver. He's the kind of guy you read about, you know, in detective novels who sweet talks and seduces a woman into going against her best intentions. He's so smooth. He's Cary Grant. Who can resist?
Not really going to church, are you?
Certainly I am.
I know you're not. You're coming for a walk with me.
Don't be ridiculous.
I don't want to do it. I'll toss you for it. Heads you do, tails you don't, huh?
And yet, at the same time, the film's so romantic. It's one of the most romantic films I've seen lately because here's Joan Fontaine. She's basically overheard her parents say she's going to die a spinster and never marry. And then who should come along but Cary Grant? I mean, come on. Who wouldn't go for that? She completely upends her life's journey.
And I loved how she was reading a child psychology book on the train at the very beginning, like the opening shot. I was like, seems like a little nod to Archie Leach.
He does well with women in trains.
In Suspicion, he's superficially charming in the true crime sociopath sort of way you're describing, but also Cary Grant, the actor, has his own sort of charm that is not superficial underneath. I don't know if you
And I think
sense that.
Hitchcock loved working with him because he saw a streak of melancholy in Cary Grant that he probably felt too. I mean, he was his alter ego. I think he played into that darkness that was obviously roiling around in Cary Grant because of his very unhappy childhood.
What the devil do you know about business?
Oh, very little. I was only...
Suppose Beaky had taken you seriously. You'd have ruined the whole scheme. You realize that?
Yes, but if it weren't any good.
That's my business, not yours. If I say it's good, it's good. I'm going through with this deal. I don't want any interference from you or anyone else. Is that clear?
Yes, that's clear.
Pauline Kael talked about how he was one of the last actors to really just not see the roles he took as expanding his artistic oeuvre. You know, he was a workman. This was a job. He was a craftsman. He learned the art of acting.
For an actor like that who didn't come up in the silence, even though he was vaudeville, I think Cale's point was something about him being unburdened by the need to be artistically validated or to prove to his audience that he's a serious actor. And so he could do a Bachelor in the Bobby Soxer and sort of go on to another prestigious role untarred, because he just sort of is so self-contained and so unique that people just accepted Cary Grant throughout his entire career.
That I was introduced to Cary Grant through his work with Hitchcock and through Charade and, you know, some of his late period work. To go back and to discover this rich body of work that existed in his 30s and his 40s, it was just so magical. And watching it with a trained eye on not what he says, but his subtle inflections, his emotes, his raised eyebrows.
He made it into an art form, into this, and that's why Screwball just agreed with him so well. Every gesture became a nuanced opinion. He could totally have like 10 opinions about somebody, and just through these subtle reactions of just an eyebrow or a goofy look or a different stance. It's all so nuanced.
I do think it's interesting that we think of the later Cary Grant as maybe more iconic. It's crazy to think that he was 54 when he made North by Northwest, when so many actors that would be the bitter end. And yet he's so amazing in that film because he is such the iconic Madison Avenue ad man.
Maggie, in the world of advertising, there's no such thing as a lie. There's only the expedient exaggeration. You ought to know that.
And it's what makes the film so horrifying. If even this man can be played, if even this man can be kidnapped and unable to explain himself, what's in store for us?
Not that I mind a slight case of abduction now and then, but I have tickets for the theater this evening, to a show I was looking forward to. And I get, well, kind of unreasonable about things like that.
With such expert play acting, you make this very room a theater.
Grant also plays an ad executive in another film in this series, Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House. He is an ad executive throughout the entire movie, as opposed to North by Northwest, but it's much more clearly stated that it's a critique of the ad industry.
Miss Stellwagen says advertising is a basically parasitic profession.
You don't say.
Miss Stellwagen says advertising makes people who can't afford it buy things they don't want with money they haven't got.
Oh, she does she? Well, perhaps your Miss Stellwagen is right. Perhaps I should quit this basically parasitic profession, which at the very moment is paying for your fancy tuition.
He goes from being confidently conning people into buying things they don't need to being suckered himself by an ad in a magazine to purchase this dilapidated house.
And I love that it's a film where he's in pursuit for once. Usually it's the women who are pursuing him. You know, Katharine Hepburn with a terrifying vengeance in bringing up Baby. But so many women, he remains unflappable and cool, and women can't get enough of him. But in Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House, of course, he's in pursuit of a house. The romance is, you know, nominally between him and his wife, played by Myrna Loy. It's really between him and this house for kind of inexplicable reasons why he takes this detour, a born and bred Manhattanite, and suddenly falls in love with a suburban, dilapidated house. But it's kind of what makes that film fun for me, because it's so different to see him with that strange passion.
Muriel and I have found what I'm not ashamed to call our dream house. It's like a fine painting. You buy it with your heart, not your head. You don't ask how much was the paint, how much was the canvas. You look at it, and you say, it's beautiful, I want it. And if it costs a few more pennies, you pay it, and gladly, because you love it. And you can't measure the things you love in dollars and cents.
But it's interesting because as the sort of man on top, like in North by Northwest, at the top of his game, is completely unable to make any good decisions at all, despite having cool heads around him telling him otherwise.
Would you mind telling me in clear, concise English just what crime I've committed and why?
In clear, concise English, you tore down a house on which another man holds a mortgage without first getting his written permission.
Well, I did.
The persona of Cary Grant is much more believable as a Madison Avenue executive than it is, say, as a paleontologist in Bringing Up Baby, where you see him in his coat and you're like, okay, like costume, just like throws a doctor's coat on, like, okay, you're a scientist now.
Right.
But
And he has the most superficial prop of the eyeglasses. And anytime he dips the eyeglasses, suddenly, it's Cary Grant.
Right.
He's a heartbreaker.
You can tell her that I'm a friend of Mark's, that I have bets in the belfry, but don't ever tell her my name is David Huxley. Now, can you remember all that, Susan?
Yes, David.
You're sure?
Yes, David. But you are good looking without your glasses.
That's a complete character change.
Exactly.
Is glasses on, glasses off.
And he comes around in the end. I mean, he stayed and buttoned down as a scientist, but by the end, Katharine Hepburn has led him on this crazy merry adventure, and so he decides that's maybe more of what he is than the paleontologist looking for this singular bone to finish his dinosaur skeleton.
Now, it isn't that I don't like you, Susan, because, after all, in moments of quiet, I'm strangely drawn toward you, but, well, there haven't been any quiet moments.
If you look at Cary Grant's enduring legacy, it can be kind of simplified to this kind of two-dimensional tableau of well-tailored suits and chiseled features and perfect posture and great demeanor, but I think that belies the fact that there's so much underneath. There's this undercurrent of abandonment, despair, and these elements that shine through in different angles through these films and through these directors who recognized what a complex character he was.
If you have any accusations to make them in the proper manner. Otherwise, I'll have to ask you to get out.
You'll ask me to what?
Get out.
And Matt, I totally connect with what you said. I think as much as Cary Grant represents this sort of dreamboat icon, he also is a very generational figure. I mean, I think of people in my grandparents' generation, some of our parents' generation, who had that persona of control, and yet, you know, there was complex stuff at work behind that mask. And so I think he's terminally fascinating because he does harken back to people, you know, in our own experience.
Captain, I'm no good. Why not? Scared stiff. How do you think the rest of us feel? Oh, you're not scared. I've looked at your faces. I looked at yours, too. It's the same as the others. You're scared? I'll say I am.
By really watching a lot of these films from that different era, you get a much better impression of his range, even though he is just Cary Grant and played a lot of Cary Grant roles.